In 1626, a Dutch official named Peter Minuit handed over 60 guilders worth of trade goods to a group of Native Americans and walked away with the island of Manhattan. $24. That's what the story says. The greatest real estate swindle in history. Except it wasn't a swindle. And the Dutch weren't stupid. They knew exactly what they were doing. Because while Manhattan was changing hands for the price of a few iron kettles, Dutch ships were sailing past it, headed somewhere far more valuable, to islands most people have never heard of, islands worth more than all of North America combined. This is the story of why the Dutch gave away Manhattan, and why it made perfect sense. To understand why the Dutch practically threw Manhattan away, you need to understand what they were chasing. In the early 1600s, there was one commodity that generated more wealth than gold, more profit than silver, more power than any other resource on earth. Spices. Not the spices you buy at the grocery store today. These were spices that Europeans would bankrupt themselves to obtain. Nutmeg, cloves, mace, black pepper, they were used to preserve meat in an age before refrigeration. They masked the taste of spoiled food. They were status symbols. They were medicine. And they only grew in one place. A tiny cluster of islands halfway around the world. The Spice Islands. Modern Indonesia. For most of human history, these spices traveled overland through Arab and Asian traders, arriving in Europe at astronomical prices. A pound of nutmeg in 1600 London could cost the equivalent of 7 fat oxen. A handful of cloves was worth more than a man's annual wages. The profit margins were insane. Buy nutmeg in the Banda Islands for pennies, sell it in Amsterdam for 14 to 17 times that price. That's not 14 to 17% profit. That's 1,400 to 1,700% markup. The spice trade wasn't commerce. It was a money printing machine, and the Portuguese had controlled it for a century. Then in 1595, a Dutch merchant named Cornelis de Houtman decided to break the Portuguese monopoly. He sailed to Indonesia. The voyage was a disaster. He lost half his crew to disease and conflict. 12 men were killed in a single attack. But when he limped back to Amsterdam in 1596, his ships were loaded with enough spices to turn a massive profit despite everything. The Dutch smelled blood in the water. Within 3 years, 22 Dutch ships had sailed to the Spice Islands. The competition between Dutch merchants was so fierce, it was driving prices down. So in 1602, the Dutch government forced them to merge. They created the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. The VOC wasn't just a company. It was an empire dressed in corporate clothing. It had the power to wage war, to sign treaties, to mint its own currency, to execute prisoners. It wasn't accountable to voters or kings. It answered to shareholders, and it became the most valuable company in human history. At its peak, the VOC was worth roughly $8 trillion in today's money, more than Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon combined. It employed 70,000 people across the globe. It owned over 4,000 ships. It operated like a sovereign nation, and its entire purpose was to control the spice trade, to monopolize nutmeg, cloves, and mace, to make the shareholders obscenely rich. The VOC's strategy was simple and brutal. Secure the source, control the supply, eliminate the competition. They seized islands, they built forts, they made treaties with local rulers and broke them when convenient. In 1619, they stormed the port of Jayakarta and built a new headquarters. They called it Batavia, modern-day Jakarta. They enslaved populations. They burned spice trees to create artificial scarcity. They massacred entire villages to enforce their monopoly. In 1621, Governor John Peterson Cohen arrived at the Banda Islands with 250 Japanese mercenaries and a fleet of warships. The Bandanese had been selling nutmeg to English and other traders. Cohen wanted total control. What followed was genocide. Thousands of Bandanese were killed. Others were enslaved or starved. The population of the islands dropped from 15,000 to less than 1,000. Cohen replaced them with Dutch colonists and imported slaves. The VOC now controlled 90% of the world's nutmeg supply. They could set any price they wanted, and they did. The profits were staggering. The VOC paid dividends averaging 18% per year for nearly 200 years. Investors became fabulously wealthy. Amsterdam transformed from a regional trading port into the financial capital of the world. Canals were built. Mansions were erected. Art flourished. This was the Dutch Golden Age, and it was paid for in blood and nutmeg. Now, while all of this was happening in Indonesia, the Dutch were also active in another part of the world, North America. But they weren't there for spices. They were there for fur. In 1609, the VOC hired an English explorer named Henry Hudson to find a northwest passage to Asia, a shortcut to the Spice Islands. Hudson failed, but he sailed up a river that would later bear his name and discovered something else. Beavers. Lots of them. and the Native Americans were willing to trade beaver pelts for European goods. Fur was valuable in Europe. Beaver hats were fashionable. The Dutch saw an opportunity. Not a fortune. An opportunity. So in 1621, the Dutch government created a second company, the Dutch West India Company. The Dutch West India Company. The Wykes. It was modeled after the VOC, but it was never as successful. It was never as profitable. It was never as important. The VOC was formed with 6.4 million guilders in capital and raised it within weeks. The Wykes struggled to raise 7 million over 3 years. Investors knew the difference. The VOC was trading spices that sold for 17 times their purchase price. The Wykes was trading fur, sugar, and tobacco, commodities with much smaller margins. The West Indies were a sideshow. The East Indies were the main event. The Wykes mandate was huge. It controlled trade from West Africa to the Pacific coast of the Americas, but its resources were spread thin. It tried privateering, attacking Spanish and Portuguese ships. In 1628, Admiral Piet Hein captured the Spanish silver fleet off Cuba. The haul was enormous, 11 million guilders, but privateering wasn't sustainable. It was a windfall, not a business model, so the Wyck turned to colonization. It established settlements in Brazil, the Caribbean, West Africa, and North America. The North American colony was called New Netherland. It included parts of modern New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Connecticut. The capital was New Amsterdam, on the island of Manhattan. Peter Minuit arrived as Director General of New Netherland in May 1626. He had instructions from the Wyck: make the colony legal. The Dutch knew the English and French were watching. They needed a clear claim to the land. Not because they cared about Native American property rights, but because a purchase agreement might deter rival European powers from challenging Dutch control. So Minuit met with local Native Americans. The exact tribe is disputed. Some historians say it was the Lenape. Others argue it was the Canarsies, a group from what's now Brooklyn. The Canarsies may not have even controlled Manhattan. The Wetquaesgeeks lived on most of the island. But Minuit didn't know that, or didn't care. He offered 60 guilders worth of trade goods. Not beads and trinkets. That's a myth. The goods likely included iron kettles, axe heads, hoes, knives, and cloth, tools, useful items, things the Native Americans actually wanted. From the Dutch perspective, it was a straightforward real estate transaction. From the Native American perspective, it probably wasn't. The Lenape didn't believe land could be owned permanently. Their concept was closer to shared use rights. They likely thought they were agreeing to let the Dutch live there and trade, not that they were selling the land forever. Both sides went home thinking they got a good deal. So the transaction was made. 60 guilders. In 1844, a New York historian named John Romaine Broadhead converted that figure to 24 US dollars. That number stuck. It became legend. The $24 purchase of Manhattan. The greatest swindle in history, except the Dutch weren't swindling anyone. They were securing a legal claim. And 60 guilders wasn't nothing. By modern calculations, it was worth roughly $1,000 in purchasing power at the time. Still cheap for an entire island. But the point wasn't the price. The point was the piece of paper, the agreement, the documented transaction they could show to other European powers. The Dutch were covering their legal bases. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Because Manhattan was never the prize, it was never the goal. New Netherland as a whole was a marginal operation for the Wyck. The colony struggled to attract settlers. The population in 1664 was only about 2,500 people. The company tried offering land grants called patroonships. Wealthy investors could get huge estates if they brought at least 50 colonists. Only one succeeded. Kilian van Rensselaer's estate near modern Albany. The rest failed. The Wyck couldn't make the colony profitable. The fur trade was decent, but it wasn't spices. It wasn't anything close to what the VOC was generating in Indonesia. Let's put this in perspective. The VOC was sending nearly 1 million Europeans to Asia over its lifetime. It was shipping 2.5 million tons of goods. It was operating 4,785 ships. It was making profits that averaged 18% annually for 2 centuries. The VOC sent a fraction of that. It operated far fewer ships. Its colonies were expensive to maintain and generated modest returns. By the mid-1600s, the VOC was struggling financially. It had gone bankrupt trying to hold Brazil. It lost that colony to the Portuguese in 1654. New Netherland was one of the few settlements it still controlled, and even that was more trouble than it was worth. Meanwhile, back in Indonesia, the VOC was printing money. Nutmeg alone was generating astronomical returns. A single successful spice voyage could make an investor's fortune. The shareholders in Amsterdam were building mansions. They were commissioning artwork. They were living like princes. And they were doing it because the VOC controlled tiny islands most Europeans couldn't locate on a map. The Banda Islands, the Moluccas. These weren't vast territories. They were specks in the Pacific. But they had something Manhattan didn't. They had spices that grew nowhere else on Earth. They had a monopoly product with inelastic demand. They had leverage. Manhattan had beavers and a decent harbor. That wasn't nothing, but it wasn't gold. It wasn't spices. It was just another cold piece of land in North America. The Wick's board of directors understood this. They weren't idiots. They could read a balance sheet. New Netherland was costing money. It required ships, supplies, soldiers, administrators, and it wasn't generating enough revenue to justify the expense. The fur trade was profitable in good years, but it was seasonal. It depended on Native American cooperation. It faced competition from French traders to the north and English colonists to the south. It wasn't scalable. It wasn't a monopoly. It was just trade. Meanwhile, every guilder invested in New Netherland was a guilder not invested in the real moneymaker. The Indonesian spice trade. The opportunity cost was enormous. And then there was the strategic calculation. The Dutch knew they couldn't hold North America long term. They were a small nation. The English had colonies at Plymouth and Jamestown. The French controlled Canada. Both had larger populations. Both had more resources. Both were expanding. The Dutch were caught in the middle. New Netherland was geographically indefensible. It was sandwiched between two rival empires. The Dutch could fortify it. They could send more colonists. They could fight wars to keep it. But for what? More beaver pelts. More marginal returns. It didn't make sense. Not when they had a spice empire that was generating unimaginable wealth on the other side of the world. So the Dutch made a calculated decision. They didn't abandon New Netherland officially, but they didn't prioritize it either. They ran it on a shoestring budget. They appointed mediocre governors. Wouter van Twiller was known for being quarrelsome and expanding the brewery business. Willem Kieft started a disastrous war with Native Americans that nearly destroyed the colony. Peter Stuyvesant was competent but cantankerous. He stabilized things, but by then it was too late. The English were circling. In 1664, King Charles II decided to seize New Netherland. He gave it to his brother, the Duke of York. 4 English warships arrived at New Amsterdam. Stuyvesant wanted to fight, but the colonists refused. Many weren't even Dutch. They were English, French, German, Scandinavian. They had no loyalty to the Wick, no reason to die for a company that barely invested in them. Stuyvesant surrendered without a shot. New Amsterdam became New York. The Dutch lost their North American colony. And back in Amsterdam, the reaction was nothing. The Wicks didn't mount a rescue operation. The VOC didn't offer support. The Dutch government didn't declare war. They shrugged, because they'd already written off New Netherland. They'd gotten what they needed from it. A toehold in the Atlantic fur trade, some modest profits, a legal claim they could use in negotiations. But it was never the main event. It was a sideshow, a distraction, a marginal operation that absorbed resources better spent elsewhere. The real prize was always in the East, in the Spice Islands, in the monopoly on nutmeg and cloves. Here's the brutal math. By the mid-1600s, a successful VOC spice voyage could generate returns of 400 to 500%. A single shipload of nutmeg could make a merchant wealthy for life. The VOC was paying dividends that averaged 18% per year for 2 centuries. That's not impressive by modern venture capital standards. But in an era when most investments returned 3 to 5%, 18% was extraordinary, and it was consistent, reliable, backed by a monopoly enforced with cannons and fortresses. Meanwhile, the Wick's returns were erratic. Some years it made money, many years it lost money. It went bankrupt in 1674. It was reorganized and limped along until 1791. It was never profitable, the way the VOC was profitable. So when people ask why the Dutch sold Manhattan for $24, they're asking the wrong question. The Dutch didn't sell Manhattan. They never owned it in any meaningful sense. They bought a piece of paper from people who didn't own it either. They used that paper to establish a colony they barely supported, and when they lost that colony, they didn't care, because the entire operation was irrelevant compared to what they had in Indonesia. Manhattan in 1626 was worth less than a single warehouse full of nutmeg in Batavia. That's not hyperbole. That's economic reality. The spice trade was generating wealth on a scale that fur and farming in North America couldn't touch. The irony, of course, is that history proved the Dutch wrong. Not immediately, but eventually, Manhattan became one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on Earth. New York became the financial capital of the world. The island the Dutch bought for 60 guilders is now worth trillions. The skyscrapers, the ports, the stock exchange, Wall Street, it all sits on land. Peter Minuit acquired for the price of some iron tools. Meanwhile, the Spice Islands that generated so much wealth for the VOC, they're poor. Indonesia is a developing nation. The nutmeg monopoly lasted until the late 1700s when French missionaries smuggled seedlings out. The British planted them in the Caribbean. The monopoly was broken. The wealth vanished. But here's the thing. The Dutch weren't wrong in 1626. They were making the correct calculation based on the information they had. Spices were king. They had been valuable for millennia. They showed no signs of losing value. The Indonesian monopoly seemed unbreakable. North America was cold, distant, and full of competing European powers. There was no way to predict that New York would become what it became. No way to foresee that the fur trade would give way to shipping, which would give way to finance. No way to know that the island would sit at the nexus of transatlantic trade. The Dutch made a rational choice. Prioritize the proven moneymaker. Let the marginal colony fend for itself. This is the real lesson of the Manhattan Purchase. It's not about being swindled. It's not about the price. It's about priorities, about opportunity cost, about where you put your resources when you can't be everywhere at once. The Dutch were a small nation. They had limited capital, limited ships, limited manpower. They couldn't dominate Asia and the Americas simultaneously. So they chose. They bet on spices. And for 200 years, that bet paid off spectacularly. The VOC made the Dutch Republic rich. It funded the Golden Age. It built Amsterdam. It created wealth that transformed the Netherlands from a regional power into a global empire. Manhattan couldn't have done that. Not in 1626. Not in 1664. The English understood this too. They grabbed New Netherland, not because they saw Manhattan's future value, but because they wanted to connect their northern and southern colonies. They wanted to cut the Dutch out of the North American fur trade. They wanted control of a good harbor. But they also had priorities elsewhere. The English were building their own empire in India, in the Caribbean. The English East India Company was competing with the VOC for Asian trade. New York mattered, but it wasn't the crown jewel that came later. After the American Revolution, after the Erie Canal connected the port to the interior, after industrialization, after immigration, after a century of developments, no one in 1626 could have predicted. So the story of Manhattan's purchase isn't really about real estate. It's about strategic prioritization in an age of limited resources. It's about the difference between what's valuable now versus what might be valuable later. The Dutch chose the bird in hand, the spice monopoly that was generating fortunes. The English took the bird in the bush, the North American colony with uncertain prospects. Both were making rational calculations. The Dutch weren't stupid. The English weren't prescient. They were competing empires playing the long game with incomplete information. The Dutch just happened to bet on the thing that was valuable in the 17th century. The English got lucky and ended up with the thing that became valuable in the 19th and 20th. And here's the final twist. Even if the Dutch had kept Manhattan, they probably couldn't have held it. The Netherlands was too small, too far away, too focused on Indonesia. The American colonies were always going to end up independent or English. The geography dictated it. The demographics dictated it. The Dutch population in New Netherland never grew large enough to be self-sustaining. Even if the Wick had invested heavily, even if they'd sent more colonists, even if they'd fought the English in 1664, the outcome would have been the same. Eventually, the Dutch would lose, because they were trying to hold territory on the wrong side of the ocean, while their real empire was on the other side. So the $24 purchase of Manhattan isn't a story about a swindle. It's a story about priorities, about what mattered in 1626 versus what matters now. The Dutch looked at Manhattan and saw a cold harbor with some beavers. They looked at the Banda Islands and saw nutmeg worth more than gold. They chose the nutmeg. It made them rich for 2 centuries. By the time the spice monopoly broke and Indonesia became less valuable, the Netherlands had already built its wealth. It had already funded its golden age. It had already become a major European power. Manhattan was a footnote, a trivia answer, a piece of land they never really wanted in the first place. And that's fine, because they got what they came for. They got the spices, they got the monopoly, they got the wealth. The real question isn't why the Dutch sold Manhattan so cheap. The real question is why anyone thought they'd value it differently. In 1626, Manhattan was a marginal asset in a marginal colony run by a struggling company. The Spice Islands were the center of a global monopoly, run by the most valuable corporation in history. The Dutch made the only choice that made sense. They prioritized the sure thing over the long shot. They invested in proven profits over speculative futures. They chose Indonesia over Manhattan. And for 200 years, they were absolutely right. History just changed the math. That's not the Dutch being wrong. That's just how empires work. You make the best decision you can with the information you have, and sometimes the world changes underneath you.